we have Amelia Lee. Amelia Lee left MDS in 2024 after having studied politics, history, English literature and art, gaining 2 A stars and 2 A's. She's currently studying politics and history at the University of Oxford. Now, an interesting fact about Amelia Lee, as you're probably aware, you have to sit a rather competitive entrance exam to get into Oxford or Cambridge, and thus did Amelia. The average score for that entrance exam was 60%. Amelia got a whopping 90%. So we are dealing with someone of great intellectual acumen. Thank you. The topic for today, for Amelia Lee, which we're all going to listen to attentively and carefully, is The Chains of Civilization, an introduction to the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So without further ado, Amelia Lee, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so as Mr. Amin has introduced me, my name is Amelia Lee, and I'm going to be speaking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The objectives of my lecture, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Rousseau. Essentially, the problem that Rousseau has is the problem of civilization. By civilization, he means the formation of civil society. And the state of nature and process of civilization is discussed by Rousseau in an essay that he writes in 1754, and that's on the origins of inequality. I'm going to start by speaking about that, and then go on to his better-known text, The Social Contract. And in The Social Contract, he essentially provides an answer to the problem of civilization that he discusses, and that was written in 1762. So I'm going to give a little bit of historical context about Rousseau. After all, I'm a history student, so I like the history side of it. He was born in 1712 in Geneva, which was pre-French Revolution. So Geneva was one of the last surviving city-states. It was its own independent republic, which means that there was no monarchy, and self-governance was championed. And Rousseau was deeply connected to his identity as a citizen of Geneva. Often in his writing, he dedicates his work to the people of Geneva, and he's very proud that he's from Geneva. And this is slightly ironic. He was stripped of his citizenship for converting to Catholicism. So Geneva was a Calvinist state, that's a type of Protestantism. And so while he had a slightly dubious relationship with Geneva, he was nonetheless very proud of being Genevan. He also had no formal education, so he's a really interesting person for us to look at because he didn't have a very expensive education. He had a lot of different jobs in his life. He was initially an apprentice engraver. He was a tutor for a wealthy family, also a music tutor, a music copier, and he also wrote an opera, Le Divin du Village. However, he was most famed for being a novelist. In 1761, he wrote his sort of Julie, which was a best-selling publication. And this is what made Rousseau famous or well-known, and that's what he would have been known for in his life. So the Social Contract, which is probably the only thing some of you might have heard about Rousseau, wasn't a significant text and didn't gain a lot of traction until after his death. And Rousseau and his text were championed by the Jacobins during the French Revolution, and they wanted to overthrow monarchy. And because he has a Republican theory, they liked his theory. So he died in 1778, which was 11 years before the French Revolution. So now I'm going to talk more about his work. So possibly his most famous line, his paradox, which is man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. So this is a really famous line in Rousseau's political writing, and it's very dramatic. As you can see, Rousseau's quite a dramatic writer. And in this he believes that man has natural freedom, and the freedom that he is born with is taken from each person by virtue of living in civil society. This is why civil society is such a problem for him. This paradox is central to his political philosophy, and in his social contract, he aims to recover freedom, albeit a slightly different form of freedom. He's very fond of his paradoxes. He spends a lot of time using the language of the free and the enslaved, and at points that this can become self-contradictory. So Isaiah Berlin, who you may have heard of, a philosopher in the 20th century, he's quite critical of Rousseau's work, and if I have time, I'll speak a little bit about that. So I'm going to start by talking about his state of nature. But to understand Rousseau's state of nature, you first have to understand the state of nature of Thomas Hobbes. For those of you who study politics, Mr. Amin talks frequently about Thomas Hobbes and his state of nature. So he was a political philosopher who wrote the Leviathan in 1651. This was 100 years before Rousseau, and that was in England. And he creates a notion of the state of nature in which there are limited resources, and thus man is naturally at war with man. So his famous line, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So Rousseau likes this idea of the state of nature. He uses the same idea, and this is called conjectural history. So it's a thought experiment. What may the state of nature be like? He argues that this is the best way to understand modern phenomena or the present state of man. But crucially, it's not a historical account. He doesn't believe that what he talks about in the state of nature actually happened. So Rousseau's state of nature is very different to that of Hobbes. He says that there is a state of abundance, so man is not in competition with man for resources. So this means that there's never going to be competition between two people for a resource because there's enough to go around, essentially. He argues also that there was not the psychological requirement for the Hobbesian state of war. There was no moral worth tied to natural inequalities. There was no comparison or notions of natural advantage and disadvantage. He argues that man is naturally good, and this isn't in a moral sense, but because there's no reason to harm other men. There are two impulses that he talks about: the impulse of basic self-preservation and the impulse of pity. And lastly, Rousseau creates a state of nature that displays extreme solitude. So essentially, there's no notion of the nuclear family. You don't live in small societies. He believes that men and women associate short-term to procreate and then return to total independence. So there's no such thing as being in part of a community. And this is crucial to his political philosophy because he believes this means that man is entirely self-sufficient. He is dependent only on himself. However, then comes the process of civilization. So I'll read out what's on the board. Savage man lived free, healthy, good, and happy, as far as they could by their nature be, and continued to enjoy the gentleness of independent dealings with one another. But the moment one man needed the help of another, as soon as it was found to be useful to have provisions for two, equality disappeared, property appeared, work became necessary, and vast forests changed into smiling fields that had to be watered with the sweat of men, and where slavery and misery were soon seen to sprout and grow together with the harvest. So as you can see, he's a fantastic writer. So he argues that when man begins to associate, live in small societies, receive the help of another, he can no longer resist the obstacles to his self-sufficiency on his own. For example, if two people join together and I'm on my own, I can no longer be self-sufficient as we're not equal anymore. So the loss of self-sufficiency results in the division of labour, which results in the irrevocable loss of natural equality, as previously insignificant physical differences assume a moral value. And by moral value, he means a social import. So this results in what Rousseau hates the most, and that's dependency. So he believes that dependency is the worst thing that can happen, as it's a total loss of freedom. He writes, "Now, since the worst that can happen in the relations between one man and another is for one to find himself at the other's discretion." Dependency in Rousseau's mind is the direct opposite of freedom, as it means the subjection to another's will. He is troubled by psychological insecurity and how comparison and psychological dependency restricts freedom. So one of his novels, Emile, is also known as On Education. And he writes about a young boy and how psychological insecurity can be combated through education. He also argues that this perpetuates itself. So he writes, men let themselves be oppressed only insofar as they are swept up by blind ambition and looking more beneath than above themselves, come to hold domination dearer than independence, and consent to bear chains so that they may bear chains in turn. So if any of you have done any work on Hobbes, you can see that here he's in direct conversation with Thomas Hobbes. So where he would argue that Thomas Hobbes creates an idea of natural man that's actually civilized man, and that there is a natural man that came before this. And so this is a subverted form of human nature. When human nature is subverted in this way, the pre-political society perpetuates itself, as you can see in this quote here. Because inequality and subjection has begun, men will favour security over freedom, and this must be remedied through a political solution. So the question becomes for Rousseau, if subjection to the will of another is the opposite of freedom, how can there be any legitimate political structures? In other words, if laws require obedience and subjection to them, how can they be legitimate? As this restricts agency, it is subjection to the will of another. So he writes his solution 8 years later, and that is in The Social Contract, and this is his most famous piece of work. So he poses a social contract whereby all people alienate their natural freedom for the sake of their utility. So essentially you give up the natural freedom that you have in the state of nature in return for a better form of freedom. And this is his civic freedom. So this civic freedom is restricted only by the general will. So the general will, as I've written up here, is the will of all parties to the social contract, with a view to the common good. Rousseau believes that the hypothetical creation of the state enjoys unanimous consent, as those choosing to enjoy the protection of law also agree to obedience to those laws, in the knowledge that this is a unanimous agreement. So if you ever find yourself writing about Rousseau, the unanimity of his social contract is at its absolute core. So he says that laws are only effective if everyone is subject to them, and no one is above the law. So he doesn't believe that there can be a monarch that's above the law. So on the next slide, the middle quote here is, each by giving himself to all gives himself to none. Each of us puts his person and his full power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and as a body we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. So essentially, you don't have particular dependence because you are dependent altogether, mutually, on each other. So Rousseau argues that as the general will is everyone's will for the common good, and the general will is sovereign, then freedom limited only by the general will is not subjection at all, and it's not dependency, as man is both sovereign and subject. So this is probably one of the most clever bits about Rousseau's work. Therefore, that the social contract is unanimous, and men will obey the general will is essential. And he argues that men will obey the general will because the general will is in everyone's interest, it's in common interest. And if it's in your own interest to do, then you will follow it. So he argues that the alienation of one's natural freedom grants them civic freedom. So this kind of civic or moral freedom is an enlightened form of freedom. By acquiring this freedom, man becomes truly the master of himself. In the social contract, he argues that the impulsion of mere appetite is slavery, and obedience to the law one has prescribed to oneself is freedom. So it's in this nature that Rousseau makes possibly his most famous argument, and it's quite a controversial one, and it's quite paradoxical, and that is that men can be forced to be free. To say that one can be forced to be free is obviously quite controversial, and Isaiah Berlin famously takes quite a lot of issue with this. However, I have little time, so I'll conclude by saying that whether or not the social contract in theory results in civic freedom is a matter of interpretation. So if any of you go on to study Rousseau, you can make up your own mind about it. He argues that natural man is free and equal due to the natural state of abundance. Civil association results in dependency to the particular will of men. Rousseau posits a political solution, the social contract, with the general will as sovereign. This contract is unanimous and it's mutual, with all men being both sovereign and citizen. So I conclude finally with a question. Is it possible to be forced to be free? Thank you very much.
Lottie Hill left MGS also in 2024, having studied politics, sociology and history, gaining 3 straight A stars. She's currently studying sociology at the University of Bath. An interesting fact about Lottie Hill, not only did she achieve 3 straight A stars, which is a no small feat, undoubtedly so, but she broke the barrier for A star in sociology by about 18 marks, and thereby gaining one of the highest scores in the whole country. I must say, Lottie, you must have had a very good sociology teacher. The chosen topic for Lottie Hill today is the contemporary logic of coloniality, how power shapes knowledge. Lottie Hill.
Okay, so hi, I'm Lottie. The lecture title is Looking at How Power Shapes Knowledge. I'll start with an introduction, and I'll be defining Eurocentrism, which sets us up for the coloniality of knowledge theory, and then I'll be looking at decolonisation as a critical theoretical perspective. So I first want to start with looking at these names and faces on the screen, and particularly noting the divide between them. So for those of you that are studying sociology, the names on the left side of the screen might stick out to you more. All of them are essentially sociological thinkers, and they contribute to foundational theories and understandings of society. But on the left, they're European sociological thinkers. So when we're taught sociology, we're usually taught this group, and we're told they're normally the founders of how we understand society. And on the right, they're names and faces that you might not have heard of, and I hadn't until I went to university and took a different module. Well, these are intellectuals, and their work has historically been overlooked or marginalised in mainstream Western sociology and social theory, either because they're non-European or even from within the Western world, because they're challenging a particular set of ideas. And the argument I'm presenting today is that their exclusion isn't accidental. It's actually linked to a historical relationship between knowledge production and colonial power. So this introduces us to the first concept. So Eurocentrism means the explicit or implicit centering of Europe in our understanding of the social world. So Europe, as you see from the map, it's a cultural rather than a geographical designation. So it includes North America, Australia, the Western world. They're all included in this idea. And the main argument is that for most of their history, the social sciences have been Eurocentric. So this includes in the choice of subject matter, so what they decide to study, in their theories, their core concepts and ideas, in their methodologies, so how they decide to study their topic, and its epistemologies, which means their understanding of what counts as knowledge. So producing knowledge about European societies by Europeans for European societies, the social sciences have also assumed that their knowledge is universally valid. So there's lots of different varieties, but one of them is historical Eurocentrism. So this is built on the assumption that European modernity was a miracle. So in other words, the idea that made Europe wealthy, technologically advanced, scientifically advanced, and culturally progressive, this is a product of European ingenuity. But this does ignore at least 2 things. One, that Europe's wealth and their industrial development owed a lot to its imperial and colonial power. So it became rich by appropriating wealth from colonies. And for example, if you reflect on what's been taught in your history lessons all the way back to year 7, there's normally a focus on, say, the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And I remember when I was learning it that there's less of a focus, or there's even an exclusion of Britain's role in colonial extraction and global exploitation, which is so important. And secondly, by focusing and saying that European modernity was a miracle, it actually ignores the fact that a lot of the ideas at the centre of modern European society happened elsewhere first.
So, for example, it was thanks to the Islamic world that Europeans discovered ancient Greece. So, from here you might be thinking, well, why does Eurocentrism exist in the first place? You know, what system produces and sustains this? Well, first, you need to clarify what colonialism means. So, it's an act of political and economic domination involving the control of a country and its people by settlers from foreign power. And European colonial expansion began from around the late 15th century to the mid to late 20th century in different forms, and extended across the Americas, Africa, Asia, Caribbean, and Pacific. And colonial rule was enforced through violence, law, and administration, and this created global hierarchies between the colonized and the colonized. And these hierarchies are of race, wealth, and power. But colonialism was never just a system of political and economic domination, and this is where we introduced the coloniality of knowledge theory. So, like I said, might be some questions. Why are we Eurocentric even outside of Europe? Why is it Eurocentric still today? Well, it isn't just a bias, it's actually a form of power, and it's the result of how colonialism has shaped not only global patterns of wealth or political institutions, but also what it means to know what is a history worth telling and what counts as valid knowledge. So, like I said, colonialism is first and foremost a system of political domination, but it isn't, and it never has been, just a system of this. It's also a system of cultural domination. So, this is where Amin-Lecture's theory becomes relevant. So, as a political project, most European empires fell between the 19th and the mid to late 20th century. But while former colonies gained independence, many of the structures of knowledge, education, culture, administration, they all remained. So, for example, I talked about the curriculum that relates to the structure of education. So, Amin Lecture, he used the term coloniality to describe how European culture continues to establish what counts as knowledge, as scientific, as objective, and as rational. So, the coloniality of knowledge, it's a systemic and structural process, and it sustains and reproduces Eurocentric practices even after formal colonialism has ended. So it's an enduring condition of a post-colonial world. So I'll introduce an example that might seem quite conceptual, but we've spoken about the curriculum in education, but other examples, we may have noticed debates in recent years regarding the British Museum and their possession of historical artefacts. Well, they have a large collection from all over the world, but these were stolen, taken, and expropriated. So, despite the fact that independent nation-states want this cultural property back to reinstate them, the argument has always been that in these museums they have the right preservation methods, and other less economically rich countries couldn't take care of them. And this relates to a paternalistic argument that only European museums are responsible enough to look after these artefacts. So the British Museum is positioning itself as the legitimate keeper of these objects and claiming a cultural authority. So the idea is, if you approach it through a different lens, the debate for the British Museum is broader than a legal or ethical question about artefact ownership, and it's actually a direct example of ongoing European control over global history and culture. So, decolonisation, we've introduced the concept of Eurocentrism and we've contextualised it within the coloniality of knowledge theory. One of the next questions might be, so how do we challenge this process? And if colonialism has ended as a political project, where do we go from here? Well, Quijano states that as even though colonialism has ended in a formal sense, colonial domination continues in the form of colonisation of the imagination of the dominated. So this means that Western ideologies have become so deeply ingrained in formerly colonised societies that they've shaped and they're actively shaping how individuals see themselves in their own culture, so leading to an idea of internalised inferiority. So decolonisation as a framework, it analyses how colonial histories continue to shape knowledge, power and inequality, and it concerns itself with how colonial hierarchies can be dismantled. So its aim is the destruction of coloniality as a world power. So in the context, what Quijano states is needed is this term called epistemological decolonisation. And it seems quite lengthy, but if you break it down, epistemology means how we know what we know, so the study of social reality. And then the whole definition means challenging and transforming colonial hierarchies of knowledge. So certain examples could be, firstly, shifting the power dynamics in knowledge production, so allowing marginalised communities to reclaim intellectual traditions that are being appropriated, and challenging the dominance of colonial knowledge in science or philosophy. For example, in education, the name I mentioned at the start of the lecture, like Quijano and Dubois, like on the right side of the screen, these could be implemented in curriculums as core theorists, or indigenous knowledge systems should be valued and taught as knowledge and not just cultural practices. And secondly, new intercultural communication. So in education, this could mean teaching knowledge as relational and situated rather than universal and context-free, or valuing multilingualism in education, so not just studying English text but looking at translations. The main idea is that decolonisation as a perspective invites us to think critically about the frameworks in which we come to understand society, and it's showing us that the voices that are prioritised are not neutral choices. And it doesn't mean that we want to abandon existing knowledge frameworks like Marx and Durkheim, but it's about expanding and rebalancing it. So to summarise, Eurocentrism describes the historical and ongoing centering of European ideas, values and experiences in knowledge, culture and institutions. And it's about how knowledge is produced, taught and validated, privileging Europe whilst marginalising other perspectives. And then I introduced the coloniality of knowledge. So these are the enduring power structures that define what counts as knowledge, as legitimate knowledge, and this persists even after formal colonialism has ended. And finally, decolonisation as a critical theoretical perspective. It's a practice aimed at redistributing epistemic authority, about valuing marginalised knowledges and challenging these colonial hierarchies of knowledge. So they're all connected and entwined. But in short, decolonial thinking invites us to question not just what we know, but how we know it, and to recognise the power embedded in the production of knowledge itself. Thank you.
We have Joseph Amin, who also graduated from MGS in 2024 after having studied politics, history, literature and philosophy, gaining 2 A stars and 2 A's. He's currently studying politics philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. One unique fact about Joseph Amin, while studying his very demanding A-levels, he also took it upon himself to read one of the most challenging contemporary philosophical texts by a guy called Alistair MacIntyre. The name of the book is After Virtue, a very challenging, voluminous work. Not only did he manage to read it cover to cover, but he managed to understand it as well, and then often tried to lock horns with me about the finer terms of the argument. His chosen topic today is Constructivism in Security Studies, the ontology and epistemology of threat. Lots of long words there. Come along and demystify.
Constructivism in Security Studies. One of the benefits of being a philosophy student is I can use words like epistemology, ontology, and have some sort of broad understanding of what they mean. I'm sure plenty of you do, but for those who don't, when we talk about the epistemology of threats, we're talking about how we study it. We're thinking about what is knowledge of threats, how do we come to know what a threat even is. And in ontology, we think of, well, what are they made out of? And that's the question I'm going to be answering today by looking at international relations theory. Now, I'm sure many of you in Mr. Amin's politics lessons, you have probably covered already in Year 13, international relations theory, realism. But I also know that some of you are from different disciplines, although they're all interconnected, as you're going to see. So, broadly speaking, international relations theory, just to keep it simple, we're thinking about how events within the political landscape can be explained. International relations theories, they tend to not just show us how things are explained, but some, of the more traditional theories, they tend to approach how we can actually provide solutions to conflicts, problems of all different natures and kinds, but specifically within security studies as a subdiscipline of international relations. We're specifically looking at conflict, We're looking at conflicts between state actors, non-state actors. We're thinking about new threats emerging to individual security. And so today we're going to see the shift of how constructivism deals with a lot more wider, broadening security issues within global politics, and perhaps is better at dealing with them than the traditional theories like realism. And today I'm only going to be covering realism because there's so much within the traditional theories, so it's easy to just keep focused on one. As you see, we're going to focus on security studies, look at security, what is security, realism specifically, constructivism, and I'm going to give you a little summary at the end, just so we can go over what we've been through. So I want to start off by posing this question to everybody. What are threats? Are they beliefs? Are they facts? You think about people in your classrooms that perhaps you don't get on with very well, they might have a go at you, you think, is it a fact that they're a threat to you? Is it a belief? Is it subjective, objective? And this is a really important question to tackle within this subdiscipline, because if we don't know what a threat is, then how on earth are we supposed to study them? I don't know if many of you read the news, but recently they've been talking a lot about the Russian threat, the Chinese threat, and it seems very assumed that we know exactly what a threat even is. Russia is a growing threat to the UK and the nation's sons and daughters. MI6 chief warns about we're in a space between peace and war, and again goes on to talk about this kind of Russian challenge. So we're very much there kind of looking at threats in a kind of space of objective, state-centric analysis, which is quite interesting, but also expected from British news outlets as well. So traditionally, I want to look at Stephen Walker, who's actually a neo-realist, but again, I don't think we've got time to go into some of the more nuances of different strands of the theories. But interestingly enough, as a realist scholar, this quote always gets me very annoyed. It's a very long quote, and actually it's saying something very simple. I've highlighted the words there because at university you just have to skip through a lot of the rubbish that some academics kind of end up droning on about, and you kind of just get to the crux of what they're trying to say. Now, within his article, The Renaissance of Security Studies, he talks about this idea of the use of force, state policies, how states engage in war, a very state-centric approach to security. The idea that the only way to study it would be to think about the state as what we call the referent object, you know, the body that is taking on the threat. And everything else around it, any threat that we can conceive, could only be in relation to the state. Interestingly enough, something I didn't write down on the PowerPoint slide, he also talks about how, through time, and he was writing in the 1990s, he said throughout time, we might see that new threats emerge, and in which case, we might have to shift away from the traditional approaches. So the key concepts that we kind of go over with threats is their state-centric approach. We think about, at the moment, we think about the US, how it's trying to acquire more resources, thinking about material power, material ontology, that is the important thing. Trying to gain resources, having lots of military power, and having a real focus on military security as a means of worldwide security. Again, a lot of politics students in this room may not, well, I mean, it's balances of power. Each different nation trying to gain more power to feel secure over others. Again, ontology of threats being material, that's kind of emphasised. Now, again, this is also very interesting, the security dilemma. The notion that upon one nation gaining more resources, my nation itself would have to also gain more resources in order to ensure its own safety. I'm sure many of you, all of you hopefully, are familiar with the Cold War, the arms race. That is essentially a very realist example of what happens when one country is advancing above another. Another side, we've got the Soviet Union, the USA, the other side has to gain more resources to keep up with the other one, or they're under threat. And that's really the kind of realist way of seeing threats in world politics. And it all comes from this idea of anarchy, the idea that we are all in this kind of, as sort of previously mentioned, this kind of state of nature, but in a more kind of Hobbesian way. The idea that we're all in competition, we're all against each other, and so we can't trust anyone. But the problem here that I've sort of found, and I think a lot of scholars have also found, is that there seem to be so many new issues emerging within world politics. There's global terrorism, there's immigration, if you think that's a threat, there's, you know, climate crisis, we've got pandemics that we've all just been through 5 years ago. There seems to be so many other things that we would perceive as threats. but don't necessarily have to come from the referent object of the state. So instead, what really are threats threatening? Well, it seems like they're threatening potentially human security. I mean, again, another poll. What is everyone's concerns that people were asked in 2016 across the survey? And of course, we're 9 years on from that now, but I can only imagine that it's changed since then. That there's a lot more issues that the world is dealing with that we're all concerned about human security. Not all of us care so much about being the boys and girls that go off to fight for our nations, but actually we start to care about other things that go across borders and aren't necessarily about nationality or the state. And that's where we have Constructivism. Now, Constructivism is also a 1990 phenomenon. It kind of came from Alexander Wentz, where it did, and it has been a kind of response to the Cold War as well in its own way. And it says that material ontology is important. At the bottom I say that. It is very important. You have to consider that states are trying to get military security, and that does create threats. But you have to look beyond this. It's no longer just about states having money or power. It's about something more than that. You know, it takes on a kind of human security lens that threats, the way we identify threats, is different. I talked there about norms, identities, and ideas, which are three very, very cool concepts. If any of you were to have studied constructivism in any sort of form, those are something you'll be very familiar with. The way that social interaction, again, sort of previously mentioned, social interactions change how we view things, our culture, our values, and that is exactly what determines threats. So again, for constructivists, what's a threat? Well, it kind of depends, right? I mean, a really good quote there from Alexander Wentz. It's one of my favourites, and I've used it recently in an essay. 500 British nuclear weapons are less threatening to the United States than 5 North Korean nuclear weapons. And that's kind of, again, emphasising this point that it's not really just about material power, because how do we identify a threat is based on our alliances, the norms of those alliances within international relations. Even the UN, we talk about norms, how countries stray from norms. We all commit to this kind of idea of human rights and upholding peace. We've seen plenty of invasions from the US into Middle Eastern countries. We're currently seeing invasions from Trump into Venezuela, which I'm not sure if many of you are aware about, but that's sort of insane, which I've put up here actually. And it's the way that the English school, which is also pro-constructivist type approach, they talk about securitization, the idea that political issues are securitized. They're put into political security language to justify political policy for objectives, whether it's nationalist objectives or something or other. And it's really interesting how Trump has been doing this with all his policies, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, withdrawing from Paris climate agreements. And it's kind of, again, coming back to that kind of new constructivist lens of, well, our identity, the American identity, for example, is now changing. And that, in accordance, has changed how threats are perceived. What was previously not seen as a threat, immigration, America was seen to be built on immigration, is now all of a sudden a massive problem because of the way that immigration and foreigners have been kind of securitized as a policy. They are now seen as a threat, just because of security language being invoked for a certain policy influence. So a summary is that threats are not necessarily facts. You can make up your own minds, especially when you're older, about potentially if you go into international relations theory in any sort of shape or form. You can decide for yourselves if you think threats can be facts. And a lot of scholars will, to this day, neo-realists, neoclassical realists, will argue that to some extent it's still very important. But constructivists bring something new to the table. They say to us that we can identify threats in lots of different ways and that everything is socially constructed. Our idea of what is dangerous to us is really in our minds, in our values, in our culture. And that's something worth considering when studying threats and security. Thank you very much.